Erev Tov, everyone. The centerpiece of this week's parsha, as we all know, is the story of the Egel and of Moshe Rabbeinu's response and of the forgiveness that heaven bestowed upon the Jewish people. So that'll be the topic for tomorrow's Parsha Shiur. But before the Parsha of the Egel, there are 6 relatively short parshas that precede it. I'd like to discuss 2 of them, maybe 3 of them with you. One of them has to do with the Ktoras. Ktoras was the incense that was offered on the Mizbeach Hazov every day by the Kohen Gadol. The Ktoras is, the Torah gives us the formula, though we may not be exactly aware of what those ingredients are in terms of our day and our knowledge. The tzlaf, for instance, is always translated as the caper bush, but most of the achronim who have dealt with this subject say it's not the caper bush at all. I know people that went to the British Botanical Gardens to look at caper bushes, and they don't meet the descriptions necessary. But there are other ingredients that are simply unknown to us. Now, the Ktoras was a strange creation, because on one hand it was lethal, and on the other hand it was the item that prevented and stopped the plagues from decimating the Jewish people. So we find, for instance, by Moshe Rabbeinu in the Machlokas with Korach, so the test of Korach was on the Ktoras. And Moshe warned them that in this case, the Ktoras would be lethal. The Ktoras would bring death to them. On the other hand, we find that when the Magefa spread amongst the Jewish people in the desert, first Aaron and then later Elazar took the Ktoras, Vateyotzar HaMagefa, and the Magefa ended. Maybe to put it in our terms a little, it's nuclear medicine. Kills and it saves. And before she point out, why did it, can't say why, but one of the lessons that the Torah wanted us to understand here is that there are no magical powers in the items themselves. It's the Rabboni Shalom, maybe Simchaya. The Torah is just an instrument. So his people felt that the Torah was always lethal, so they would never bring it. The Kohanim would never offer it in the Beis Hamikdash. Who wants to play around with it? On the other hand, if the Torah was always therapeutic, so then we would look for the Torah to stop the pandemic. So that would put an undue meaning to the Ktoros itself. And what was the Ktoros? It was really nothing. We're talking about a fragrance, a smell, something that's tangible. It's an ambience, it's something that exists, but you can't hold it. The Gemara says that the Ktoros was so powerful. The example of the Gemara is that the goats in Yericho would sneeze from the fragrance of the Ktoros in the Beis Hamikdash. The wind was downwind towards the east. So then the fragrance of the Ktoros reached Yericho, the Jordan Valley, and that the animals would sneeze from it. And on Yom Kippurim, the Ktoros was the main avoda. And the machlokes between the Prushim and the Tzdokim was when the Ktoros should be offered, inside the Holy of Holies or outside. So the Ktoros itself did not have magical powers. The magical power was the mitzvah of the Ktoros, the korban of the Ktoros. And we have in Jewish tradition that the Ktoros had an influence on people's livelihood as well. That the Ktoros was a beneficial item for the economy of the Jewish people. And we have that today. There's a custom in certain synagogues that there's a cloth, a piece of parchment that has the parsha of the Ktoros written upon it. And by Jewish tradition, if you read the parsha of the Ktoros off of that cloth, that's supposed to help you in your financial matters. That's based on the idea from the Beis Hamikdash itself. So all of these things had supernatural powers that we cannot explain, not rational, but it's not magic. It's the Tzivli Hashem that lies behind it that does it. And the Ktoros is the primary example of that. And maybe because of the fact that it had these qualities, both of being lethal and of therapeutic, it was left to the Kohen. Because we find that we'll find in the Parshas Metzora and in other areas that the Kohen was the one that dealt with all of these types of problems. And the Kohen was supposed to stop the Magefa. And therefore the Kohen had these standards of life to follow in order that he should be the one to be able to apply the Ktoros correctly. There's a second parsha that deals with the Kior. The Kior was a fountain, basin of water made from bronze, nechoshes. And the Kior was filled with water. The Gemara in Yoma describes it. And the Kohanim, before they began the service, would wash their hands and their feet with the waters of the Kior. The Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash worked barefoot, so therefore they have to clean their feet as well. There's a famous medrash that Rashi quotes, that the bronze from the mirrors of the Jewish women were donated to the Mishkan, and out of those mirrors, Now, in the time of the Mishkan, they did not have the silver plate, the type of glass that we have for mirrors today. So they had burnished copper, burnished bronze, polished, and you could see a reflection in it. And the Torah says, Maros Hatzovos, the mirrors that were part of the home of the Jewish woman, they donated it. So Rashi quoting the Medrash, so the Medrash says that Bezalel didn't want to use it. Mirrors are used oftentimes to enhance the beauty of a person, and not always for holy purposes. So if you want to build a Mishkan, and we're so careful with the material that's going to be used, then why should we, so to speak, use something that was employed for physical purposes solely, not for any spiritual purposes? So Rashi, quoting the Medrash, says that the Ribono Shel Olam told Moshe that's not what happened. That when the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim, the men gave up. We find that by Moshe himself, that Moshe's father, Amram, said, why should we bring children into the world, that they should be mocked into walls. It's a miserable world. So why should we bring children into it? And you hear that today also. That's part of the progressive philosophy. Apart from the fact that the children are a burden and everything else, but who needs them? American politicians said that the world is going to end in 10 years, so there's no use having children. It's amazing how such nonsense flourishes. But it's amazing that it's always been there. It's not something that happened now. So in any event, the men physically live with our lives anymore. We don't want children into Egypt. We don't want it to happen anymore. Remember that there were Rebbes and rabbis who survived the Holocaust. That I knew very well. And they would discuss with me that sometimes people came to them to have children because of what they experienced. And they were convinced that it could and would happen again. So why should they have children? The great testimony to the Holocaust survivors is that they did have children, and they did provide for other generations, and that they built and they looked ahead. They didn't wallow in the past. So they didn't want to use the mirrors. The Ribono Shel Olam said no. There's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, Tachas atapuach orticha. I aroused you. So it says that the Jewish women came to mirrors and they sat next to them and they said, let's look in the mirror. And after a while, they overcame them And they lived together as husband and wife, and children were born. And therefore, the Maros Hatzovos were seen as a positive and as a negative. That there really are no negatives. It depends what you do with them. It depends how you use them. And therefore, the Maros Hatzovos wanted to go into the Kior, wanted it to be the means of purification, because the intent was that the Jewish people should survive. And that's what they produced, was the survival of the Jewish people. If that being the case, then they're holy and sanctified. It can also be that they can be used for immoral purposes. That always exists. So that's true of everything in life. What's your intent? What do you want it to produce? What are you dedicated for? It's true of speech, true of behavior, true of wealth, true of everything. All the items are neutral. It's the intent that determines what they are and what use they'll be put to. And therefore, the Mishkan came to teach us that lesson through the Kior, that things that are mundane can become holy and used to increase holiness throughout the people. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash, Omer Rotzak Baruch Hu V'Zakos Yisrael, V'Chachir B'Lahem Adonai Chavetz Ma'atikal Yagil Tadav Yadir.